Okay, so the last MASH tool that I want to introduce you to is dynamics. And so this dynamics will simulate kind of real and kind of simulate gravity and simulate collisions between objects. Super cool. Let's go and create our MASH network here. Create my cube. Delete this old cube from the scene. And I'm going to create a MASH network from that. And I'd like to distribute this actually in a grid. And I'll do 3 by 3 by 3. And then I'm going to choose this dynamics node. And you see in the scene, we have this kind of yellow dotted line that's indicating a plane, and that's going to be a kind of ground plane that's inserted. Let me just go ahead and play this and you can see kind of what happens, which is that the cubes are influenced by a kind of gravity solver, and then they collide with this ground plane that's been added. So I can go to my dynamics tab here, and I have a number of different properties that I can play with within this physical properties tab. Friction, if I increase friction, that will make the objects more sticky and stick to each other in the simulation. Damping just kind of slows the overall simulation. So you can see this is now falling at a very slow rate. It's a way that you can kind of temper the entire simulation. And then they fall. And so now that I have friction increased and I've used that damping, they aren't bouncing off of each other. And then the last thing is bounce. And bounce really does exactly what you think it would do, which is it creates a kind of bouncy material and kind of way that the MASH network, all of the mesh iterations of that mesh bounce off of each other. And so it adds a kind of bouncy quality to the dynamic simulation. So let me go back to my MASH tab and maybe add a random node, and let me randomize maybe rotation a little bit. Which will change the nature of the simulation too, so that they're not just kind of stack on top of each other, but kind of scatter. And what you've also maybe noticed, like, oh, there's other things here like mass, so you can increase the mass, and then there's some other options down here, but I would just kind of initially play with these physical properties. You also see in our outliner, we have a new node, this MASH bullet solver. And so if we click this will give us some of our solver settings, which is really useful. And what you can see here is that we have gravity is set at -9.8, which is a kind of real gravity. Okay, one thing that I do want to mention about any, and this it holds true for a MASH dynamics or any other dynamics that we'll use in FX here. This is my FX menu set. And so we're going to be diving into all of these within the coming weeks, not for this project. This project is just a MASH project, but all of these other simulation and FX capabilities within Maya. And so one thing to keep in mind for all of this is that it translates. You want to always have your scene. Let's go up to Windows and go into this Windows, Preferences, Settings. And we want our working units to be in centimeters, but know that the scene, any simulation scene, is actually calculating these at meters. So every unit is 1 meter. So all of the calculations as they relate to kind of real physical space are in meters, even though they're in centimeters here. Another thing while I'm in my preferences, and again I got here by going to Windows, Settings, Preferences, is to just be sure in your time slider that you have the playback at play every frame. every time that we want, because we're not keying anything, every frame of a simulation builds on what happened in the previous frame. And you want to make sure that when you're playing through your animation, that it's calculating and completing and actually running through every frame and not skipping any frames. So you want to set your max playback speed to 24 frames per second, but you want to make sure that the playback speed is play every frame. Another way to get to these settings are here, right? This little button, the animation preferences. Anyhow, so that's just to say that gravity here is at a negative 9.8 meters per second, is the rate at which these objects will fall. And then I have the ground, and I can, just as I can set kind of parameters for the objects, I can also set parameters of friction and bounce and damping and position for the ground. So I can make both the ground very elastic and bouncy as well as the objects. And then what's really important here are these collider objects. So let's say, because right now this is interesting, kind of that it's just kind of falling on this plane and bouncing, but if I wanted to interact with other objects, let's go ahead and add a sphere. And let me go back to my mesh, my bullet solver, and I'm going to again middle mouse click on that sphere and drop it into my collider objects. And now these objects will also interact with the sphere and fall off the sphere. I can also animate the sphere and then add it as a collision object, and these objects will interact with that animation. But I can add these kind of static colliders in this bullet solver. And I can add more than one here. You know, I can instead make these, rather than falling down, they can like fly up, so it doesn't have to just be that your dynamics are recreating a kind of gravity, but you can change the way that the simulation runs based on any of the parameters that you have in a bullet solver, which again are just kind of all of your with the settings for the ground and where you can add colliders, and then again in your dynamics tab here, the physical properties for all of your iterations. So I hope that gets you started with MASH for this week. I would say that I really want you to start to experiment with this, but then also please look at your project one of all of your peers and write really good critical feedback. That's an important thing to do this week as well. And it is tied to your grade. Part of, if you look at the rubric for project one, part of your grade is associated with whether or not you've participated in the critique. So please look at the work of your fellow students and give them really thoughtful, discerning comments on what's working about their project ones and what could be improved. And if you have any questions about MASH, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. Please add some play blasts by Sunday so we can all kind of see what we're experimenting with here. And feel free to kind of jump ahead and maybe try out some of these other MASH nodes if you feel like it. We will get into more of these next week.